Sul sul, huba nubi. That was me talking in Simlish, which is a language that was invented for the game The Sims, which has been about in many different incarnations since 1996. I'm not a massive gamer, but my brother had some consoles, so I usually used to just get home from school and play his. Yeah, we had games on the PC and that kind of thing, and yeah, that's kind of where I first started playing Sims. For those of you who don't know, The Sims is a game where you have these little people and you can make them look the way you want, and you can build them houses that look the way you want the houses to look, and you can buy them furniture, and they can go to work, and you can choose what job they train in, and they can fall in love, and they can have babies. God complex. So the absolutely genius creators actually invented a language for them so that it would have more universal appeal. But did they invent a language for them? Yes or no? I've been thinking about that recently just to see how far they really got. So Simlish is what we're talking about, and that's the actual name of the conlang. Invented languages are technically known as conlang, which I think is amazing. Conlang being short for a constructed language. It is really quite a seminal game. Probably one of my favorite ever games. I got really into the game and The Sims, to the point that where I was thinking about them when I wasn't actually playing the game. So many artists have featured on the Sims soundtrack, where they have basically done a rendition of the artist but singing in Simlish on the top instead of in their native language. Blackeyedpeas, Lily Allen, Flaming Lips, Depeche Mode, My Chemical Romance, Pussycat Dolls.
But it's a Peruvian noob. But it's a Peruvian noob. But it's a Peruvian noob. But it's a Peruvian noob.
Yeah, everyone's got involved. In terms of really famous conlang, you've got Quenya and Sindarin, which were constructed languages made up by J.R.R. Tolkien, obviously the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Those were kind of mega conlangs with full vocabulary, grammar, syntax, all those sorts of things, which were really cleverly thought out and really kind of fully fledged as languages go. I think that the fact that a language was kind of made up for the game was really clever, because not only does the game have really universal appeal in the sense that you have these little characters that you can put a stamp on, but that they have this kind of universal code in which they're communicating with each other, almost like a little private unintelligible language, but you kind of feel involved because you kind of understand what they're saying to each other somehow. The game is simple, the language is sort of idealistic, kind of addictive for people looking to put their stamp on something otherwise untouched, kind of like a blank canvas. To quote one of the Sims game designers, Miku Kandaka, he said, "The more abstract something is, the more you can insert yourself into it. A face with 2 dots for eyes and a line for a mouth can be you, but the more detail you add, the more it becomes somebody else." Lesson in life to keep it simple, I think, and potentially also a lesson to not put yourself in too much of a box. I think labels are bad. I think that's maybe also something to learn from the quote. So the language was first developed by a guy called Will Wright. He developed it for the first Sims game, which was Simcopter, which was released in 1996. I kind of really liked some of the information I was reading about how Simlish was actually created. So they got all these people in a studio: voice director, sound director, composer, and that kind of thing. They tried to create the voices using musical instruments initially, but it sounded absolutely awful. So they came to the conclusion that human Sims would sound better with human voices. So they ditched the whole musical instruments idea, thank God. Apparently in one of the trials, the improv guy was given a sheet of Navajo and Ukrainian phrases, and he just started saying them, and they sounded really rubbish. By the end of the second or third trial of the Simlish practices, everyone was getting really frustrated. People were standing behind the glass screen and they were smoking and swearing, and they were just really, really angry with the whole thing. And they felt like it couldn't get any worse, like it just wasn't going anywhere. And then apparently someone picked up a poem and started speaking kind of a gibberish version of English, like all kind of gummy and weird sounding. And then everyone started to put their headphones on and thought, yeah, I like this, you know, we can work with this. So from that point onwards, the two improv actors stood in a studio talking complete gibberish with each other for hours and hours and hours on end, and kind of arriving at, you know, I guess something really, really far away from, but semi-approaching lingua franca. And for those of you who don't know, a lingua franca is kind of like a language that gets settled on, or a form of communication that gets settled on in the absence of a common language spoken between two interlocutors. So, for example, people might get around a table and all of them are speaking a different language, but because, you know, it's a business meeting, they might decide to use English if they all know English. It's a commonality. It's a way of everyone speaking together and understanding what everybody means. So they agreed on some norms, some of which you'll recognize from the game. So yeah, obviously we've got sul, which is a bit like, yeah, sul can be used for hello or goodbye. Deg means goodbye. Fliblia is fire. So yeah, it has some recognizable lexemes, and during the practices and the trials, certain nouns basically got identified, a certain intonation, and probably accent dialect. Yeah, let's call it a phonetic. Let's move away from accent and dialect, and we'll call it a phonetic agreement. Yeah, while they were talking, they kind of landed on that. And it's quite cool because as the game became more complex in later versions, the language kind of evolved to encompass, you know, more complex emotions or ideas. So for example, in one installation of the game, you'd have, you know, Bradley cooks, the sim Bradley cooks. But then in later versions of the game, you'd have a kind of different intonation and maybe even new lexemes to show Bradley cooks happily. Yeah, so in that way, it's quite nice that the language evolved in a certain way. One thing I was thinking about playing with the idea of is because the language was obviously improvised in the studio between the two sound actors and kind of became its own thing. It kind of reminded me of how languages are created in the natural world. So pidgin languages are where two or more people who don't speak a common language come together. This tended to happen in society due to forced circumstances. So for example, with the slave trade, there were lots of people who spoke different languages. Words and communication methods had to be agreed on in order to communicate and live harmoniously and efficiently. So one person would know the word for frying pan, another person would know the word for fire. So they might use each other's words and eventually kind of agree on certain norms which would enable them to communicate as a community. People who had initially come together had formed what's known as pidgin language, which is this kind of mishmash of lots of different languages pulled together, that those people would then have children in the community who initially settled and spoke the pidgin language. And when those children were born, they would grow up learning the pidgin language from their mother and father. However, they would actually naturally fill in the gaps, okay? They would fill in the gaps to make it a more fully fledged language, because as you can imagine, the pidgin language would have had gaps in it, and it probably wouldn't have been formalized or standardized in any particular way. But obviously, you know, when children are born, that there's a few theories about how and why they are able to move the pidgin to the next level of language, as it were. Yeah, that they turn it into what's known as a creole. And the creole is typically the second generation of language speakers who grow up in the pidgin speaking community. You know, that they learn the pidgin language, but then they fill in the gaps. Yeah, the creoles end up having tenses in them, and proper verb conjugation. I'm not saying that Sims became a Creole in later incarnations of the game, but I like to think that in later versions of the game, the increasing complexity of the game demanded different phonemes, different intonation, and in that way it advanced the, let's call it pidgin language, Simlish for now, but I think technically not, but it's a nice idea to play with. However, it does have a really nice purpose, which is to convey emotion and of course makes for a charming voice for our little homegrown characters. The other thing I was thinking about is, technically for a language to be alive, it needs to have living speakers. So that's how languages become extinct. Basically, the last living speaker of a language will die, and there the language will become extinct. So these little bots, these little avatars, are they alive? Or maybe it's more important to ask if they'll ever truly die. It's something to think about. However, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed this random ramble that I've gone on. If you're looking for a tangent to your evening.